All right, welcome everyone. I'm so excited to be connecting today with two leading experts in the field of financial risk and regulation, the wonderful John Danielsson and Robin Greenwood, who are dialing in from London and Boston. I believe, Robin, you're from Boston, respectively.
Yeah.
It's the first time that they're speaking at the IEO seminar series, and I'm super excited to have them. Love their work, love their papers, love the advice that they give to financial authorities. So very happy to have you both, Robin and John. I just wanted to give you each a more formal introduction, even though I know that so many of our participants are going to be very familiar with your work already. So I'll start with our first guest speaker, John. John is one of the two directors of the Systemic Risk Center and professor of finance at the London School of Economics. John has written 3 highly regarded books, including The Illusion of Control, which was included on the Financial Times Best Books of 2022 list. He has also contributed numerous academic papers on systemic risk, artificial intelligence, financial risk forecasting, financial regulation, and related topics to leading academic journals, including Review of Financial Studies and the Journal of Econometrics. John's practical and authoritative perspective on financial risk and the financial system means he is regularly interviewed by media organizations, including the BBC, Financial Times, the New York Times, and the Wall Street Journal. And last but not least, to all our audience, if you haven't checked it out, be sure to check out his blog, Models and Risk, among other things, if you want to keep up with his thinking, including on AI and threats to financial stability. Our second guest speaker today is Robin Greenwood. Robin is the George Gunn Professor of Finance and Banking at Harvard Business School. Robin's research is in behavioral and institutional finance, with a particular focus on macro-level market inefficiencies. His other interests include asset pricing and capital structure. Robin has also co-authored research on the role of government and central banks in the debt markets. He was a previous member of the Financial Advisory Roundtable of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York and a research associate at the National Bureau of Economics Research. Robin has authored several papers and has received numerous research awards, including the inaugural 2014 Jack Traynor Prize awarded by the Institute for Quantitative Research in Finance. So today, we're going to talk about financial stability risks and the role of both micro and macroprudential regulation. And this is very important. So I'm really excited to hear your tips and ideas about this, because I think it's going to be really helpful. And for those of you who are systemic risk and regulation experts, you're still going to hear insights that are going to help you form your views. So, John, I want to start broad with an overview of financial regulation and whether you think the current approach is the one we should be using. And then, Robin, we're going to hear from you about some specific indicators of impending financial crises and the empirical evidence that has led you and your co-authors to believe that a more proactive approach by policymakers and regulators might be called for. Before I give the floor to John, let me remind everyone that the seminar is being recorded and will be posted on the IEO website and the IEO YouTube channel. So if you have a friend or a colleague who was interested in today's topic but couldn't make it, feel free to go there next week and you can grab the link and share it with them. And if you haven't muted your microphones, please do so we can have a good sound quality. So now, John, over to you. You'll be our first speaker.
Thank you so much, Helen. I do hope you can see my slides. Otherwise, do let me know. Technology is always tricky. Now, this topic or my presentation is based on my book, The Illusion of Control, and things I've done more recently or subsequently, all of which one can find on my website or my blog page, which is indicated on the slide here. But the problem we are looking at is basically a finance 101 problem. How can we get what we want out of the financial system? Well, we want growth, We want solve inequality, deal with environment and the like, but we don't like costly crisis and abuse. So this is a typical risk-return trade-off. Well, but there are technical problems in dealing with that, which is why this is such an important and fascinating topic, particularly because we lack data. And the fundamental question is, how can we control a system that is in effect infinitely complex like finance? If you look on the possible outcomes from the worst to typical to best, for the typical outcomes, the day-to-day outcomes, we have plenty of data. Events are frequent, events are similar. This means learning is easy and control is easy. But when it comes to the best and the worst outcomes, we have increasingly little data, the more important the events become. Events are infrequent. They're almost always unique in detail, which means that learning is very hard and controlling the system and getting what we want out of it is even harder. And the way we tend to deal with this, which is incorrect in my view, is that we use the data we have in the middle of the outcomes, the typical day-to-day outcomes, and we use that to project onto the extreme outcomes and say, well, we learn about how the world works by looking at typical data, and we assume it works for the more extreme important things. And that is, for me, at the core of the illusion of control. To begin with, we have to agree on what we think is risk, and there is no single definition of risk. Risk is individual to you and me. What you see as risk is not what I see as risk. And if you look at institutions, banks, countries, organizations, everybody has a different view of what risk is. So trying to project risk onto a single metric or single measure, as is all too common, will tend to mislead us away from the optimal objective. And if you look at all of these risk factors, we just get paralysis by analysis. So that is not productive either. But similarly, risk is not a measurable quantity. Risk is latent in this language of statistics, which means we need a model that I've sometimes called a riskometer to measure risk. We plunge it deep into the bowels of Wall Street we see there. And of course, the problems by measuring risk with models, all models are wrong and some are useful. And this means in practice, we have an infinite number of risk measurements for the same quantity and often no way to discriminate between them. Fundamentally, however, day-to-day risk is not important to the vast majority of human beings. This means that things like volatility value at risk, VIX, CDS spreads, and the like, they are basically irrelevant. What is important is extreme risk. And extreme risk is determined by politics. The global crisis in 2008, the pending crisis in Italy, Trump, Ukraine, Taiwan, Venezuela, we can continue on. Politics allows problems to emerge and politics prevents timely solutions. At its core, the inability to deal with environmental challenge is political. Problems is booms deliver short-term tangible benefits, and we don't like to pay for future bad outcomes. One way to think about this is to see how politics has shaped the fortunes of countries. If you go back a century, in the sample I have, Korea and Taiwan are the poorest countries, but Argentina and Venezuela and Mexico are doing quite a bit better. So what determines which of these countries went up and which went down in the ranking over the past 100 years? Political decisions driving economic fortunes. So politics is supremely important when we think about what we want to get out of the system. Now, when connecting that to how individual financial institutions go about making decisions, I like to go back to an old paper published in Econometrica in 1952, the same year as Markowitz did his mean variance diagram, but this by a person called Roy. And he said the way financial institutions optimize is they maximize profits subject to not going bankrupt. Because to my mind, it's a much better description how most financial institutions operate practically. So if you allow me a simplification, financial institutions optimize for profits 999 days out of 1,000, but on that one last day, when a big shock hits the system and a crisis is on the horizon, the financial sector no longer maximizes for profit, it maximizes survival. And what do they do on that one day? Well, that is when they no longer supply liquidity into the system. That is when they put all the money on the reserve account at the central bank. That is when they cancel all this standard credit and the like. And that behavioral shift is at the core of why crises are both so difficult to prevent, because this is a perfectly rational behavior. There's nothing wrong about this. You can't regulate this away. You're just trying to stay alive. But it also explains the economic damage from crisis, both because of a liquidity crisis affecting other financial institutions, but also because the real economy is denied credit. So that optimization problem is a fairly good guide in understanding how institutions operate. If we start looking at how one can create policies or formulate policies out of this, fundamentally, there are three drivers of extreme outcomes and crisis in the financial system. The first is excessive leverage, meaning institutions are vulnerable to losses. The second is the self-preservation instinct I discussed in the previous page, the 1 day in 1,000 problem. They want to stay alive in a crisis. And the final is complexity, which means that they no longer trust the counterparts in the system. So, however, even if you have those three same fundamental drivers of large losses, there are infinite number of events that can affect those fundamentals. And to my mind, all financial crises are fundamentally the same, and all crises are unique in detail. And in a way that is axiomatic, because if crises were not unique in detail, we would already have created mechanisms for preventing them. So by definition, they must be happening where the existing control mechanisms no longer work. And of course, for the financial authorities, if the system is infinitely complex, they can only patrol a tiny part of it. So therefore, it is axiomatic that crises happen where the authorities are not looking. But this also affects learning. How can we learn about something that is at its core unique and has never happened before? And that takes us to, again, to what the objective of financial policy should be. To my mind, the most important objective of financial regulations, macro and micro, is to maximize economic growth, subject to both the micro objective of protecting the users of the system, also the prevention of too many costly crises, and also other social objectives like equality, environment, and the like. The objective of financial policy is not to de-risk. It is not financial stability, compliance, reporting. These, to my mind, these are only instruments to meet the objectives listed above. And I think too many people, when they think about or discuss financial policy, they focus on these instruments like de-risking, but they neglect why the system, why we have the regulations there in the first place, which of course ultimately is to meet social objectives outside of the immediate financial world. And that takes us to in two really different policy directions. If we think about current macroprudential regulations, which are policies designed to protect a country from the collapse of a very important bank, well, the way we do it now is to create very large liquidity and capital buffers that then prevents those institutions from failing, and we protect society that way. And of course, what's happening is, and we can certainly see this in the current lobbying political game being played with the Basel III endgame, this leads to a cat and mouse game where ultimately the buffers become bigger and bigger and bigger, add ever more cost to society, but also creating increasing political opposition. And I think one thing the authorities should keep in mind is that they have to politically be able to implement the policies they want, which is increasingly becoming doubtful. There is an alternative, and to my mind that is we can find the financial system is an amazingly resilient entity. It is designed to absorb shocks, not to amplify them. And we can design policy not by using liquidity buffers and not by using capital buffers, but we can build resilience by increasing the shock absorption capacity of the system. Now, what takes away from the buffers and away from resiliency? Well, anything that makes financial institutions similar in outlook and similar in action. And regulations, unfortunately, do that. They harmonize beliefs by telling banks how to measure risk. They harmonize actions by telling them how to react to shocks. When we have level playing fields, which are more important in Europe than in the United States, we have level playing fields increase the fixed costs of complying with regulations, which then further can lead to an increasing returns to scale, fewer and bigger systemically important institutions. And the thrust of financial regulations since the crisis in 2008 has been to focus on the measurable, the middle of the distribution I discussed earlier, the day-to-day things. Not what really matters is the extremes, both the good and bad. And of course, for the authorities, this is a very difficult thing to do. And I am fairly convinced there will be another crisis, and that crisis will happen when nobody is looking. I would much rather go back to Finance 101, diversification. In finance, we are taught from almost day one that a diversified portfolio is better than investing everything in a single asset. And that, of course, is just a technical expression of what our grandmother told us, not to put all the eggs into the same basket. And fundamentally, the more heterogeneous or diverse financial institutions are, the more different they are, the higher the ability of the system to absorb shocks become, the better financial regulations are tailored to the user, both in the corporate sector and to individuals, and also the lower the cost of regulation, since we don't have this very intrusive and extensive regulatory apparatus. And the best way to deal with the illusion of control which arises from looking at day-to-day outcomes is to focus on and work towards diversity in the type of financial system we have. And that is quite easy to do. I mean, the authorities can't mandate diversity, of course, they cannot do that, but they have quite a lot of tools that are easy to use. They can encourage institutions to be as different from each other as possible. One way to do that is simply by the licensing regime, whereby you encourage, and they have special regimes for institutions bringing new business models. Well, in Europe, if you talk to the authorities, they might say, oh, we do that already, but that's only what they say. In practice, that's not what happens. And that means to eliminate or reduce barriers to entry, especially for those with new business models, and give them tailored new regulations. That also means to embrace fintech, decentralized finance, perhaps via CBDCs or other digital currencies, and also recognizing that by and large, with exceptions, and I'm not saying that as a universal statement, shadow banking is by and large not the enemy, but a friend of stability and well-performing economies. So, okay, if that makes sense, why does this not happen? Well, one is simply innate conservatism. We tend to prefer what we know instead of what is new. And the one expression of this, if you know your Homer Simpson trivia, where every time something new is proposed, one of the characters says, but oh, somebody think of the children. All the objections we get to new ideas in the system is, but something bad could happen. So the focus becomes, just because something new could possibly lead to a bad outcome, it must be prevented. But this also means risk aversion. It is better for a lot of people in the system The more uniform the system becomes, collective failure covers individual failure, so it's easier to be incompetent in the financial system if institutions are more similar. And of course, fundamentally, the incumbents, they prefer the existing setup, because the more intrusive and especially the higher the fixed cost of regulations, the better off the incumbents are, especially the big systemically important organizations. So all these three factors, that is what prevents a diversified financial system. Will AI solve the problem? So this is not my topic today, but there's one conclusion out of our work on AI, which is that AI will help with micro regulations, the day-to-day control, but it will amplify the macro problem, the financial crisis. And key to that is to understand speed. AI speeds up decision making. And of course, in a crisis, as we all know, there's a rush to exit. The first bank to react gets the best prices. The last to act faces bankruptcy. And if you want a really nice case study of that, look at Archegos Capital a couple of years ago, when the first three prime brokers to react avoided all losses, and then the losses were taken up by two other banks, one of which failed last year. So AI will be super quick in selling into a falling market, calling in loans, running others, making a crisis worse in a vicious cycle, amplifying volatility. It will speed up responses and acting as a crisis amplifier, which means that a crisis that might now take days or weeks might end up taking only minutes or hours. And of course, the policy response to that, or the crisis response playbook today, is inadequate to such a world. The authorities, by and large, do not have AI engines to monitor the systems. They have no ability to regulate, to understand how AI makes decisions, and they prefer to have considered responses to crisis rather than what will become increasingly common, which is triggered facilities. So therefore, getting close to concluding, for regulations to be effective or macroprudential policy to be effective, the authorities must have a solid understanding of the distribution of the tails or the extremes. They must have effective tools for dealing with those extremes and the political support to wield those tools. And I suspect they have none of these things, because the focus is on the visible middle. And ultimately, as we know, we can have all the discussion of how to sensibly deal with crisis, but at the end of the day, it is the political leadership that decides on what has to be done, which of course is inevitable in a democratic society. And that is why my preference is for regulations that work with the problem against the problem, meaning why diversification is a win-win-win solution. It is good for the system, it is good for the clients, it's good for the economy. And there is nothing new about these ideas. And one economist stated this quite eloquently in 1945, Friedrich Hayek, in what is my favorite paper ever published in the American Economic Review. He was writing about central planning at the time, but he could just as easily have been discussing risk or macroprudential policy. So he said, if we possess all the relevant information, if we can start out from a given system of preferences, and if we command complete knowledge of available means, the problem which remains is one purely of logic. This, however, is empathetically not the economic problem which society faces. So, with that, I'm finished.
Well, thank you, John. This was extremely thought-provoking. So I'm sure we're going to have a great discussion. We're going to hold off the questions and comments for the end. So for now, yeah, I see some clapping. Definitely, absolutely appreciated. We're now going to turn to Robin for his presentation. And Robin, I think you, if you hold off for a few minutes, we will have your slides up in a few minutes.
Great. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Very good. Thank you. Shall I start, or shall I wait until the slides are coming up?
They're coming up, and you're welcome to start or wait a little bit. I think they're coming up.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much. And do I control these, or I just ask somebody for the next slide?
Amy will move them for you.
She'll click them. Thank you so much. So thank you, Ellen, for inviting me to this, and I enjoyed very much, John, your last presentation. You gave me a lot to think about, especially this overall question of whether we live in a faster and scarier world. It reminds me of a lot of what people talked about Silicon Valley Bank, and that it was the first bank run to happen over Slack because of the speed of at which people responded. So this is what I'm going to do is present just very briefly this paper that I have written with Andre Schleifer and Jacob Sorensen and Sam Hansen, co-authors of mine. And it's really about this question of how predictable financial crises are. And I feel a little bit embarrassed in front of this group because this is a topic that you thought about at the IMF for so long and with so much data. But hopefully, we'll have some perspective on these issues. And if you could go to the first slide, please. And really what motivated this was our conversations with the lead policymakers in the US. And I think these are different than what you hear around the world, where people are, much more open to macro pru. But in the US, by and large, the perspective after the crisis from folks like Geithner, Paulson, and Bernanke was that what we had in 2008 and 2009 was largely unpredictable. And that therefore, what you need to be very good at as a government is putting out fires when they start, and forget about whatever. The last presentation was a lot about policing, and trying to think about less about policing and more about firefighting. Next slide, please. So what we do in this paper, and you could just click through it until everything shows. Thank you so much. So what we do in this paper is try to recognize that there's a lot of history of people studying crises. The most famous papers written actually at the IMF and at the World Bank in the 90s and in the 2000s. I think what that literature basically recognized was that crises were preceded by periods of weak economic fundamentals. But still, if you look at them, they sort of think of crises as sudden, unpredictable events. And this is quite different from, I'm going to call it the older behavioral perspective of people like Minsky and Kindleberger, and some recent work by folks like Shularik and Taylor, and a lot of work out of the IMF, like by Claudio Borio and others, really saying that credit expansions, or essentially credit bubbles, are the origin of many financial crises. So I think that intuition was out there, but we didn't think that there was that much in terms of having a simple model of how exactly a credit bubbles could lead to financial crises. Next slide, please. So what we do in this paper is really try to build that evidence, and it's the simplest empirical paper I've probably ever written. You can fit all of our data onto 7 or 8 columns in Excel and 1,500 data points. And what we try to do is estimate the probability of crises as a function of 2 variables: past credit growth and asset price growth. And our concept here is, coming out of basic economic logic. So when you have a credit expansion that's accompanied by an asset price expansion, you can interpret that as a supply shift in credit. And so what we did is try to look at situations where you have, for example, household credit expansion combined with house price expansion, or business credit expansion combined with stock market booming. Or you could have looked at, for example, credit spreads falling, which would be a similar thing to do. There's more data on the stock market than there is on credit spreads. And essentially what we're going to do is construct a simple indicator, which is we're going to call things overheated when the credit is booming and the asset prices are up. And we're going to look at what that implies for the probability of a crisis. And what you find is that the probability of a crisis is hugely responsive to credit growth and asset price growth in the tails. So I think this is related to the last presentation in the sense of, the middle of the distribution is essentially uninteresting when you're thinking about crises, and the tails on both of these is where all of the interesting action is. Next slide, please. Next slide. Yeah. And the other thing I'll say is I've prepared a little bit of data to show you where we are today, just to give you a sense in terms of some of the more recent data. So what I'll show you is I'll construct this variable. We're going to call it the red zone, which is the joint occurrence of asset price growth and credit growth. And as I said, it's a natural signal of an outward shift in the supply of credit. And we will show that the probability of crisis accumulates for about 3 or 4 years after this overheating measure. Interestingly, you have lots of early warning. If anything, the predictability is larger at a 3-year horizon than at a 1-year horizon. The other thing I'm going to show you is that business and household credit booms are separable. So when we first started doing this, my strong prior was that they were going to have a common component. In other words, if you've got a household credit boom, then of course you have the same thing going on in the business sector. Actually, it's not true in the data. And in fact, 2008 was largely a household credit boom driven phenomenon. But if you look at other crises in history, they're largely corporate credit driven. And so you get information from looking separately across these two markets. They're particularly dangerous in the rare instances where they occur in tandem. I like to point here to what I think of the most famous example of kind of credit markets overheated everywhere, and that was Japan in 1989. You had both household boom, you had a corporate credit boom, but sort of everything was on fire at once. Next slide, please. We also, and I won't spend time on this, but the overheating in credit markets has a global component and is correlated across countries. So, for example, Germany in 2007 did not look like it was in a major credit boom. However, it was vulnerable because everybody around them was in the middle of a credit boom. So there's this global component to measuring these credit booms. And then at the end of the talk, I'm not going to do the full analysis, but I will just allude to some stuff in the paper where we try to think about, this is again very related to the last talk, how you should think about this as a policymaker. And really the question is, I'm going to say, wow, financial crises are largely predictable. They rise to a probability of 40% conditional on some variables. But you could, I think, reasonably say as a skeptic, say, hey, 40%, don't pat yourself on the back. That means that you're wrong 60% of the time. Right. And which means when you're predicting a crisis and nothing happens, you might be forcing banks to put in too much capital. You might be doing all sorts of things that you think are making the system safer, but maybe choking off growth and so on. So we do some back of the envelope math to try to think about, is our evidence strong enough to get you to want to act before? And I would use here, Sam Hansen, my co-author, has this wonderful analogy. He always talks about, what do you want to do if you think that crisis is coming tomorrow? It's a bit like if you know that the plane is going to land on the runway and you've got no wheels on the plane, you're going to pad the runway. So that's one set of actions. On the other hand, if you think that you have got a long lead time, maybe there's some things that you could do a little bit differently, maybe capitalizing the banks and so on. Next slide, please. I'm going to skip the data. This very simple data here we're using from other folks, where our crisis indicator is from Barron, Werner, and Sean, but we've also done in the paper Reinhard Rogoff and Jorda Shularik-Taylor. Many of you in the audience know these data sets. They're just simple measures of when a country is experiencing a financial crisis. The two variables we're using, as I said, is the growth in business and household credit. We do this like everybody else in the literature, looking at the 3-year change in credit to GDP. And then the second thing we're looking at is asset price growth. In the stock market, we're looking at 3-year price appreciation. And then in the housing market, it's the same thing. We're using data from the BIS. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to show you the main results. They're right here in one table. So it takes a little bit of explaining, but I will focus your attention on the matrix on the left. So what is this? When you go from left to right, you go from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. we are looking at credit expansion, and this is business credit expansion, so the non-household sector. And when you go price tercile 1, 2, 3, that's just going from low to high in terms of stock price appreciation. Okay, so on the bottom right, in other words, you see a cell that is highlighted. That is the period where you've had lots of credit expansion, business credit expansion, and the stock market is up. What am I showing you in each of those cells? It is the probability of a crisis over the next 3 years. And you can see all of the action is in that right tail, right? So that rises from that middle value of 8 to 45% when you have stock market boom combined with a business credit boom. Okay, follow down the bottom of the picture, also on the left side. I'm showing you the same thing with household credit and household and home prices. So when people are borrowing a lot more to finance housing, and at the same time the housing market prices are up, you know, you have a substantially elevated here, a 37% probability of a crisis. You can ignore, if you want, those two matrices on the right. All that those matrices are doing is they're literally differencing everything out relative to that center cell. So, for example, it's just relative to the 8 or relative to the 3.3. Next slide, please. So we also, of course, do this in a regression context rather than go through the details of this. The reason the regression context is useful is because it allows you to sort of look at the probability of a crisis as a function of these predictors at different horizons. So, for example, you can forecast a 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, 5 year, and so on. And I'm going to be doing that in the next slide if you bring that up. So here is those results. So this is exactly what I just showed you, but I'm now just doing it in a regression. And so if you look, for example, on the right, I'm showing you the probability of a crisis within 3 years as a function of high debt growth, high price growth, and then what we call this R zone, which is when both of these are happening at the same time. You can see if you just use the R zone as an indicator variable relative to a constant, you're predicting a 34% elevated probability in the probability of a crisis. And you can see if you look at those left columns, there are prices. If you're trying to do this at a 1 year horizon, there's very little action. So it's really that predicting crises is sort of a longer term, coming out of credit booms is a longer term phenomenon. Okay, you will also notice that the R squared in these pictures is not that high because why? Of course, much of the time there is no crisis and the elevated probability of crisis doesn't materialize. So this is a game where you're often wrong. And so even though we have a pretty good model and we've got capture an elevated probability, you have to be mindful that you're wrong a lot. Next slide. Okay, I think when you do this kind of work, you ask many other questions. This is empirical work. How robust is this? Is this driven by just a crisis? And so on. There's lots of stuff in the paper that addresses these points. I'm going to address really just questions here 2, 3, and 4, which is, does overheating in the markets for business and household credit represent a single underlying factor, or are these separate phenomenon? Surprisingly to me, household and business credit booms were much less correlated than I had guessed. So largely separable phenomenon. Next question, how much is driven by global overheating? Turns out you get a lot of incremental predictive power if you construct a global factor as well as a local factor. And we go through that in the paper. In other words, if you're a small country and things are looking okay, but the whole world is in a credit boom, you need to be mindful of what that means for your financial institutions and probability of crisis. And as I said, I'll talk about the policy making aspect in a moment. Next slide, please. So this is the last part of the paper, which is we tried to recognize that while we're excited about the level of predictability, we still are wrong a lot in the sense that we fail to signal some crises, and we also generate a bunch of false alarms, right? Like any model, John said that every model is wrong, some are useful. I think that's something you have to recognize here. And so what we did in the paper is try to think about a more formal summary of the statistical trade-off that is faced by policymakers. And I want to just kind of give you a simple intuition for that, which is imagine that financial crises were infinitely costly. In that case, even if you had a very bad predictor of crises, but it gave you a little bit of information, you would want to act on it. On the other hand, imagine that financial crises are kind of, like you'd rather not have them, but it's not that costly. And by the way, if you do things like countercyclical policy, that those are very expensive to do. Well, in that case, you'd want to have a very, very good model, and you'd want to be right most of the time in order to act. And so we try to quantify that in the paper and do a very simple calibration to try to understand, is our predictability evidence strong enough that one would want to act on that? Next slide, please. So what we do is we start with these basic contingency tables where we try to understand the true and false positives as well as the true and false negatives. And the thing I would just point to in this table is this is literally just a summary of what's in the data. You can see that there are just so many true negatives. Most of the time you don't have a crisis. So a crisis happens every 25 years on average. All right, next slide, please. I always like to show this slide because this is the entire data set, and I think it's very revealing of what we have in terms of our results. This is literally showing you the credit growth on the bottom axis and then price growth on the top. And then what we call the red zone is up on the top right here. And every one of those dots is a crisis that happened. And the yellow is what we call the yellow zone, which is more expansive definition of crisis of credit boom. You can see also captures even more of the potential crises. Now, pictures are often better than words, but pictures also can mislead. And so I kind of often ask people, what's misleading about this picture? One thing that's misleading is it's not showing you the crises that we missed. Sorry, not the crisis, the non-crises, right? So of course, there are lots of dots here by construction where no crisis happened, right? Because these are all percentiles. So each one of these cells has the same number of actual observations, and we're just highlighting here the actual crisis. But in any event, I think this gives you a sense of the data in terms of how closely linked financial crises are with these massive credit booms. Next slide, please. Next slide. Going. I'm going to skip this actually in the interest of time. Well, I want to show you, and let's skip this as well. I want to show you where we are today. Okay, so a lot of folks ask me, where are we today? Do we look like we're in the red zone? And the answer is no. This is doing this analysis for the US, Canada, Japan, and the UK. And so we're looking here at 3-year change in household credit and 3-year change in, this is in house prices. I will point out that we did this a few months ago, and as you know, you're an official institution. The data is not available for many of these aggregates. It's with a lag, so this is a bit dated. But anyway, the main thing I think that you see with this is we have not had massive credit expansion. And I'm going to show you the corporate side as well in a moment. In the US, Canada, and UK, we've had more of a credit expansion in Japan. Of course, prices are up. So if you look at the vertical axis, we're in the higher levels in the United States for homes. But credit, if anything, because of the Fed tightening cycle, we have had a reduction in household credit. Next slide, please. This is doing the same analysis, but looking at businesses, so non-household credit. And you see largely the same picture. Here, the difference would be in Japan, where things are looking a bit frothier. So there's been more of a credit expansion on the business side there relative to other industrialized other industrialized economies. Okay, next slide. So this is my last slide, and this is my attempt to tie this to John's talk and also to some questions that I received prior to this talk. Really open issues when you're, from my perspective, when you're thinking about this. One thing is, John talked about politics. The findings that I've just showed you abstract away from any policy that presumably is trying to avoid crises, right? So oftentimes people are actually doing things, and yet you find this predictability, right? So I think say a couple of things about that. First of all, from an econometric perspective, to the extent that people are pursuing successful policy, that would make it less likely that we would find such predictability in the data. Okay, so that would be one general point. Having said that, it does raise the question of whether awareness of these issues, I mean, the world is just talking about these issues much more openly today, combined with higher capital requirements for levered players, helps make us a more resilient world today. And I think that's an interesting potential hypothesis. I think one of the things that there are a couple forces that actually make it difficult. One is the pace of crises unfolding, as John pointed out, which may be higher going forward. And then the second is the timing of official interventions. So even if you have a good model, thinking about what the pacing is of different types of interventions is tricky. I've had a conversation with a colleague of mine at Harvard many times where he says, if you're trying to lean against the bubble and you're kind of disorganized and you get to it too late, then by the time you pull the trigger, it's right when the bubble is going to pop and you're actually going to make it worse. So I think there are a lot of issues like that still need to be worked on. Last point I would make here, and then I'll close, is I haven't spoken very much about the non-bank financial sector, although my credit aggregates, of course, include other forms of credit. I would point you to some recent evidence by some colleagues of mine who are looking in the private credit space. This is only one of those spaces, and looking at leverage ratios and resilience there. But I think this is an open area and one of much interest. And I think with that, I will try to stop, and hopefully I'm stopping on time here. Thank you.
Yes, wonderful. Thank you, Robin. Yeah, you've controlled the time magnificently, so thank you. We are, and this was a great presentation because it had the macro picture combined with I thought was more of a micro picture that John gave us. So with different lead times, right? In the macro world, you have 3 years, you're talking about years, and then micro, it's minutes or hours. So we're gonna open it up for discussion. I'll start with any questions in the chat. I know there's one question from Lucas, and then if you'd like to come in from the room, just unmute and come in on the screen to ask your question. So I think we have a question from Lucas first for you, Robin, on whether you try to use credit gaps instead of credit growth rates in your analysis.
And a credit gap defined how?
This is my question. So let me defined as a deviation from long-term trend.
Yeah.
So we have.
Yeah. So what we did here is we looked at the change in credit to GDP over 3 years. So you're looking at credit to GDP today minus credit to GDP 3 years ago. So to some extent, it does a bit of that detrending because you're scaling by GDP. So there's a mean, if you think of some kind of every economy, it has some kind of steady state credit deepening over time, right? So that mean of that variable is not zero, right? Because of credit deepening. If you thought that kind of credit to GDP was a constant, then you would just be focused on the cycle. But there's credit deepening over time in the world. And so that number, I forget what the average number is, but, it might be 2 or 3% of increase in credit to GDP pretty much every year over the sample. So this was an issue we talked about quite a bit. I think there might be, we didn't discuss it in the paper, but among the co-authors, when we were sort of trying to set this up, we ended up using our formula, this formulation in terms of the predictability, just because everybody else had used this variable this way, and we weren't trying to reinvent the wheel in terms of the definitions. But you're absolutely right. If you didn't control for GDP, then you would want to detrend in some way, right? So I think we have a regression in the paper where we do this. We say, instead of saying, okay, we're going to look at credit to GDP, we'll look at just the log change in credit, but then you want to include the log change in GDP, nominal GDP, also as a control in the regression. And then maybe you want to include some kind of detrending.
Mm-hmm. So if I may just comment on that, because my question came from this, that I think that it might be perhaps better at identifying, because I think that the predictability will be different if there is a period of high credit growth after if the economy was already on the trend. Let's say the credit to GDP was on the trend, but if you see 3 years of rapid credit growth, but it followed deleveraging like immediately after GFC, I think these are two different situations. So maybe deviation from the trend would have would be better at predicting. Just food for thought.
I just wrote down, and this is very interesting. I haven't looked at it carefully. I guess it would be pretty straightforward to include some kind of a trend term in our regressions. I guess you would do something like you want to be careful about not having look ahead in the trend, but you could maybe do something on some backward looking window that's rolling. But it's an interesting idea. By the way, there's a very nice paper by Emil Werner and some co-authors. I love this paper. It's a different way of doing kind of what we're doing. Instead of looking at just credit overall, they do sector by sector credit, and they show that what's really risky is when you have credit to the less productive sectors. So credit growth in tradables is much less concerning than credit growth in non-tradables. So, households and local sectors like real estate.
Thank you.
So, John, you'd like to make a comment or add something?
Yeah, so I have quite an interesting paper, Robin. Really grateful for having the chance to listening to it. So I've done some work in the same area with similar things, and I might have some color on what you're finding, which is that we looked at perceptions of risk and low risk. Perceptions of low risk forecast crisis and growth up to 10 years into the future. Perceptions of high risk, they are correlated with stress, but they don't cause it. So in other words, by the time you observe high risk, things already have happened and there's nothing you can do about it. The single exception to that is when credit growth is excessive. So if you couple excessive credit growth with perceptions of low risk, like we had in the years before 2008, that's when both factors strongly drive crisis. So this just complements what you found. So quite interesting.
That's very interesting. I mean, it reminds me of there's some very nice work by Arvind Krishnamurthy and Tyler Muir. You may have seen this, where they were looking at credit spreads ahead of crises and credit, as a measure of kind of risk perceptions, and showed that if you look very long before the crisis, the world is not anticipating it. But once you kind of enter the beginning of a crisis, the credit spreads turn out to be quite useful for thinking about how bad it's going to be.
Absolutely. So I saw that paper. So I think we are just painting the same picture with different dimensions.
Very interesting.
So unless someone in the audience has a question, I have one for you, John. While the audience gathers their thoughts. You mentioned at the beginning of your talk that politics was extremely important, and then later on that financial regulation should not aim to de-risk or focus exclusively on financial stability, but aim to maximize growth subject to other conditions. So I was wondering how you bring these two together. If politics is extremely important, and just to be a little provocative, and let's say politicians really want to maximize growth, wouldn't they sort of latch on to your recommendation for financial regulation to optimize growth?
Well,
how does it play? Where does politics intervene? Maybe you can elaborate a little bit more on that.
Well, fortunately, I am not briefing the populist politicians, so they haven't latched onto this idea. So hopefully that will not change. However, I think the point is, however, the point is correct, but the point I'm making is slightly different. I think when the regulators miss sight of the fact that the objective of what they're doing is to help society, and they focus too much on de-risking or controlling risk without creating a narrative of how what they're doing helps the real economy, they open themselves up to attacks from the political sector. And I think this is exactly what we see in the United States at the moment. And I suspect it's only a very short amount of time until the populist parties in Europe discover the same idea, find that the ECB and macro pro is a convenient thing to attack. So policies and policy recommendations that don't take the political reality into account are doomed for failure. So at the very least, the political dimension belongs in the discussion of effective policies.
Very good, and I think that's definitely a point that at the IMF there's a lot of reflection going on about that, because the political factor has grown in importance over time. So now it's worth thinking about how to intentionally integrate it a little bit more. I saw that Martin, do you want to come in? You have a question for John?
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah, John, thanks very much for a very interesting presentation. Just a question, I mean, just to understand a bit more your thinking about the fact that I agree that extreme risk matters and that it's driven by politics. And it seems to me that you're putting a lot of the blame on the regulator for crisis. What are your thoughts based on your presentation on a crisis like LTCM? Was that an extreme risk driven by lack of regulation? Was it the fact that entry was allowed but risks were not monitored at systemic level? I mean, how a crisis like that fits your hypothesis in terms of what drives extreme risk?
I mean, the LTCM is a really good example of something that nobody thought about until it happened. So the risk that arose with LTCM now is a textbook example. I teach it, and I'm sure Robin might teach it as well. So it's entered the textbook, but it surprised everybody in 1999 when it happened. So LTCM was certainly not systemic, but LTCM also changed the way the system operates. It changed the way we think about liquidity and prime brokers and the like. So to my mind, it's an example of how crises come out of nowhere. And that is why instead of trying to create a mechanism that prevents past crises, which I think is too strong a tendency in current regulatory design, rather go back to more fundamental ways of thinking about resilience and say, how can we design a system that is robust against a broad ranges of crises that might happen? In other words, how do we focus on resilience rather than buffers? So LTCM is one of the cases that informs me on why I think we should focus on resiliency rather than the current buffer-based approach, which is very fundamental in macroprudential thinking at the moment.
So we're going to come back to the chat with a question for Robin. Miranda, would you like to ask your question, or do you prefer that I read it? Either way works. I can read it. So Robin, the question from Miranda is, did your model predict the 2023 regional bank crisis in the US? You mentioned it earlier in your remarks, Silicon Valley Bank, et cetera. And if not, why not?
Oh,
You're muted, so might want to unmute.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Great, sorry. We were in the yellow zone in 2022, not the red zone in the US. So we were not in the high crisis probability if you look at overall credit expansion. So I don't really know how to answer it. I would say if you classified the regional banking crisis, I don't think we would have called that a financial crisis overall. So I don't think we would have called that a one. It certainly had the potential to spiral. But in the narrow sense of your question, we did not, the red zone was not a predictor because the red zone was not flashing at that time. And why? Oh, sorry. And to answer the question, why? Credit growth was not high enough. So if you look overall, we were in the midst of a tightening cycle. And so credit growth was not that high. And yeah, so I think that was some idiosyncratic features having to do with the banks and those risk exposures. And I think this actually goes to John's point, which is we didn't really realize that to think about that type of bank risk exposure until it happened, and then everybody paid attention to it. By the way, interestingly, nobody seems to be paying attention to the regionals today, who are facing exactly the same set of issues as both Silicon Valley, if anything worse, because of the commercial real estate apocalypse. But in any case, maybe because of the Fed, the recent rate cuts, people have turned their attention away.
By the way, this question makes me think about something that in your talk, John, you didn't mention, which is that by focusing on building buffers, right? The current approach focused on building buffers also mean that banks hold more and more government bonds or safe assets on their balance sheets. But when things go the wrong way, then the safe asset turns into a sovereign banking doom loop. So that's also possibly another thing that diminishes resilience, an unintentional side effect, I guess.
and I mean, if you go to Europe, you find find an interesting consequence of this, which is that because the Europeans tend to like to use banks to finance the sovereigns, which at least you don't do in the United States. So therefore, in some countries, the banks hold over 20% of all sovereign bonds, which is not the case in the US, and that of course gives even a stronger bank doom loop. So I know the ECB is trying to unwind that, but that's turning out to be a very difficult problem to deal with, since if nobody buys government bonds, you have to force somebody to buy them.
That's right, and also that's right. Outside the U.S., not just Europe, but in emerging market and developing world, there are also a lot of the banks play a key role in financing the sovereign as well. So we're gonna go back to the chat. Edda, would you like to ask your question?
Sorry, it's some time to come to the camera. So this is a question for Robin. So you mentioned that in the paper you try to identify common components, and I was wondering whether the paper shed any light on the view that the GFC was caused by the interest rates in the US having been kept low for too long, and then it created imbalances, etc. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. We did not, in this paper, look at that view directly, but I have looked at that in other work. And in fact, at some point, I hired a student to collect the data on this. There's often people say things like the central bank gets the party started, investors go, here's a narrative of crisis. The central bank gets this party started. Investors keep it going through maybe some extrapolation cycle. And then ultimately it's too much. And then there's some trigger for a crisis. That's a common narrative. What makes it hard in the data is what, people call variable leads and lags. So I think you could tell that story of 2008 easily, which is that the Fed, kept rates below what the Taylor rule should have suggested for a couple of years. It was too easy, and then things got out of hand. But there's no way to really prove that, because if you look systematically in the data, you don't find that thing. So it's not true, for example, that low rates precede every crisis with a 3-year gap or something like that. That is not true in the data. So I'm very sympathetic to that worldview and have tried to find some evidence for it. There's some recent evidence by Alan Taylor that I think, with some co-authors, that speaks to that question. I forget exactly what they find, but they're sort of investigating things along those lines.
Just to come in on this point and just to reinforce what Robin is saying is that we also have plenty of cases in history where the opposite happens. So if China had gotten concerned in 1995 that interest rates were too low, or credit growth was too high, China would not be what China is today. So, and there are many other such cases. So while one can say, you can find a variable that I have read probably hundreds of papers that have found causal factors for 2008. If you have one observation, one crisis, you can map everything to it, including low interest rates or anything else. The real problem in the scientific literature that I've been working, Robin has been working in, how do we find something that works consistently across many, many crises? And this factor, I have not found this factor in the work I've done to be significant. Because basically you get both outcomes. You get the positive and the negative. So you need them. There might be a common factor that the literature hasn't identified yet, but so far, no.
Can I wanted to make one more comment, not on the question, but on to something that John said early in his talk, that I thought was interesting. One thing you might look at is there's some in the finance practitioner world, there's there's a lot of talk around this paper by Mark Kritzman and some other folks on what they call relevance-based prediction. And what they do is they try to identify, it's not, rather than having a standard linear model, they essentially say, suppose you're trying to predict some outcome, you want to find how similar that other period of history was along a bunch of other different covariates. Kind of, how similar is the world today relative to what we were seeing in 1968, that kind of a thing. So they have a different kind of style that is good for picking out the extremes. So it might be an interesting methodology to look at in terms of that issue, because I'm very sympathetic to that issue, which is, in the prediction space, you're trying to predict these relatively rare events that are every one of them is unusual in some way.
Robin, can you repeat what that approach was? Relevance-based?
It's called relevance-based prediction. So this is some work that folks in the asset management world have developed. I can't speak to the econometrics of it, but the intuition of it is to really try to identify observations that are relevant for predicting the thing that you are looking at. So to give you a kind of a trivial example, suppose I told you that the market is up 10% one day, and I asked you to predict the return. Well, what most people are going to do of some stock, people are going to say, take the beta of the stock and multiply it by the market. But what this prediction would say is, well, geez, what's most relevant for days when the market is up is looking at other days when the market was up and looking at how that stock moved around those times. So it's really trying to narrow in the space in which you're making the prediction in the area in which the data you're looking at is relevant. So
thank you. Yeah, I'll look it up. It sounds super interesting. Rachel, you had a question for both of our speakers. Would you like to come in?
Yes,
Ask your
thank you.
questions.
Thank you very much. So very interesting talk. So I would expect that, policymakers have a view already about, the relationship between credit growth and asset price growth and its impact on crisis. So, presumably they've done their own estimates, and yet crises keep happening. So my question is why? Is it that or there's, perhaps several reasons why. As you mentioned, it was mentioned before, there's a political constraint that they cannot tighten sufficiently to prevent it. Or perhaps they have tightened sufficiently, but, the credit asset price impulse is so strong that it keeps going. Or, more uncomfortably, these things are inherently unpredictable. They come out of nowhere. So my question is, what is the practical implications of the results? I guess it's for both. Thank you.
Maybe if I start and Robin comes in afterwards. So one of my favorite exam questions is exactly what you just asked. So I put it on many, many exams for my students. And it's sort of, if you get this right, you're almost guaranteed an A, because it's just a nuanced question. The reason, of course, to my mind, is that we have such a complex system we are trying to control. And there are so many fundamentally very large factors driving investor behavior. So what happened in 2008 with CDO, so what happened with LTCM a decade earlier, what happened with Silicon Valley Bank, and we have so many such examples. They surprise everybody, but then we change the way we do things. And in a system that is infinitely complex, there's an infinite way this can happen. So a policy that is designed as a whack-a-mole, I'm going to find all these holes. This is what drives up the buffers I'm so concerned about. It's an impossible task. So therefore, from a regulatory point of view, trying to go more to the fundamentals of how can we map the crisis onto a very broad ranges of behavior and broad ranges of outcomes. And that is what is driving my idea of diversification in the type of institutions we have, and there are other ways of doing it. So to my mind, it sort of leads to a little bit of a more fundamental review or revising of what financial policy making really should do.
I agree with everything that John just said. I always think in the asset management world of what is the definition of a crowded trade? Crowded trade is when an asset is held by people who tend to behave in the same way. So they have correlated views or they have correlated inflows and outflows. And I think, so I'm very sympathetic to that general view of diversification among institutions. So I would say but more specifically, Rachel, to your question, I don't think that these things were that much appreciated through history. So I think that that's why there's greater awareness of these issues today than ever. If you look at the literature coming out of the BIS has been kind of amazing in this, right? They have been pounding this basic topic for at least a decade, if not more. But there really was very little understanding of this other than the early papers by Carmen Reinhart with her co-authors, Kaminsky and others. But a lot of that was kind of focused on, it felt like it was in the emerging markets and they're special and they have all their currency issues and all that kind of stuff. So I think we actually have more of an understanding today. But then all the other issues that you raised are true as well, which is if you have an imperfect response function with lags, and you have the risk that you make things worse, that makes you cautious to act. And so all of those things are true. But I am more optimistic today about some of the broad forces that we understand. And again, John said something like this, bank capital is a simple way to deal with a lot of it, which is that when you have better capitalized institutions, It creates a buffer against all sorts of things that you haven't been able to anticipate.
There is this one footnote, since I agree with everything Robin said, there is yet another dimension to it, which is that if you read the really old literature, like John Maynard Keynes in 1936, he talks about a lot of these issues. Hayek talks about them, and the 19th century literature talks about it. So therefore, I always find sort of, when I do my lecturing, I say a policymaker from 1900 would not have been surprised by the crisis in 2008 in the way that the policymakers got surprised in 2008. So we used to have a lot better understanding of these problems, both in the policy academic literature, that we did until we just lost track for 50 years of these issues. But we are now rediscovering them.
So, very good way to bring our event to an end. We're rediscovering the old issues and shouldn't lose track of them. Well, this has been so much fun to connect with you about this, and I know it's going to be very helpful to all of our participants. So to the listeners, thank you very much, and the participants for your questions. Thank you for joining us today, and we'll see you for more. So bye for now.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you so much,
Thank
Robin,
you.
and thank you, John.